Welcome to the InfoSec Insider podcast, brought to you by URM, the UK's leading information and cybersecurity specialists.
Hi, my name's Annie and I'm here today with Alastair, Stewart and Tibor, Laczko, who are both consultants and QSAs with us at URM. Welcome to another episode of InfoSec Insider. So today we're going to be talking about how organisations can prepare for a PCI DSS assessment in a way that's going to make it as easy and efficient as possible. So my first question for you guys is, what should we have ready before we even book the PCI DSS assessment?
Lots of things, but you should actually have at least done some kind of pass to make sure you're compliant. It's rare that, certainly from my perspective, I don't know about you, but it's rare I'd want to jump into an assessment blind without having the client had some kind of prior look at compliance or done it before or worked with us before in some way or some kind of gap analysis or something, you know.
Yeah, well, again, it depends whether it's a first assessment or it's a reassessment. If you work with the client before, there's, the assessor understands the environment. I don't know if that's the case. Usually what I need to understand is, has anything changed? Is there a new payment channel? Is there a new system? Is there any significant change? Has the scope changed? And then, it's easy if it's a reassessment. If it's a new assessment, I agree. It's weird to go into an assessment when you've never met the client before, unless, there's always a kickoff or a gap or even before the assessment, you meet the client, you talk to them, and then, as if they can explain their scope, if they understand, the difference between a service provider and a merchant, there's, high hopes.
No, you're right. With new clients, a pre-assessment is key to understanding. It's also, I find it's helpful with new clients as well if that pre-assessment conversation happens, because then the client can understand what we expect to see, because each QSA will work differently. So if they work with QSAs in the past, it can be handy for them to understand exactly what we're going to be looking for during the assessment, the types of evidence, all that kind of stuff. So you should have at least spoken with your QSA. And if, as Tibor said, if it's a reassessment, you need to know what's changed. You need to be able to tell your QSA what's going to be different, what's going to be new from last year to this year, what new environments have maybe been put into place, or even new staffing members. If management have changed, that can be crucial to know before you go ahead and book assessment in. The last thing we want is a client to book an assessment, turn up to start, and then find on day one there's something drastically missing and we have to reschedule everything, because that's just going to be annoying for everyone.
And ownership, I guess, is one of the other things. When you have a client calling 15 people in a call and none of those 15 people are able to answer your questions that the meeting was before. And then planning. All of a sudden the scramble of pulling people in and whatnot. So a clear schedule would be ideal, and people understanding
who's going to be able to explain what to the QSA, who's needed on what call, about what environment, which documents are needed, which person is needed, so that when you get into each meeting, what you're talking about and the people are there who can help you.
So next question for you guys. How do you know if your scope definition is clear enough?
The QSA doesn't look puzzled when you show it to him.
And you can explain in definite sentences. It's not a question mark at the end.
I think what a lot of time I advise my clients to do is start with a data flow diagram to work out where the card data is flowing through, and then overlay that flow on your network infrastructure. And then suddenly you've got a clear idea of exactly what's going to be in scope. The network diagram should also include things that are out of scope. So once you've overlaid that card flow, you should then know, well, these networks are out and these systems are out and these third parties are out. So it should be easy to work out what's in and out of scope. But you start with the card flow, always start with defining where your card data is, where it's flowing, and what systems are touching it first.
And then once you do that, you have a system inventory. So you should be able to identify every single system that is in scope, what's out of scope, adjacent, and so on. So that gives you a clear picture. And luckily, with version 4, what is it, 12.5, I think, your system inventory, you have to validate your scope anyway. So previously it was a nice to have that the client had all this prior to assessment, during the assessment. But now it is actually a requirement that they have to maintain, which sort of kind of, I think, makes our life a little bit easier.
Yeah, an asset inventory with a PCI flagged and for easy sorting is a godsend as a QSA to be able to just go click, this is everything that's in scope, or just look at these. It makes it much easier.
So looking at sort of the evidence side of things now, what does usable evidence look like from a practical perspective?
Some of the evidence you have to collect from a live system. The assessor should be there even now over WebEx or whatever, Teams or whatever, or in person, because some clients are like, okay, I'll take all the screenshots. You tell me which system, and I'll send you all the screenshots. And according to the assessment guideline, that's not acceptable.
Yeah. People could try and easily pull the wool over your eyes and just give you a selection of systems that are specifically the good ones. So a lot of the time, the assessor needs to be doing it live. The assessor needs to be going, I want to look at these systems, log in and show me, and then collecting screenshots. But by the same premise, when you're looking at samples of, for example, change tickets, that's the kind of thing that an assessor can select a bunch, and then they can go away and export those change tickets for you. It doesn't have to necessarily be done live. The assessor selects the sample, so there's a random sample, and then they go away and get it for you. Policies and procedures and documentation, that can all be sent through whenever and reviewed whenever the assessor's got time. It doesn't need to be done live. But for system configurations, for confirming network infrastructures, all that kind of stuff needs to be realistically as live as it possibly can be. I say you don't have to be on site with the modern Teams and remote setups. It's all easy to do that kind of remote view stuff. Although for physical security, obviously, your assessor going to want to walk around the property. And there are provisions in place if some data is too sensitive to be kept by the QSA. The data, so the evidence can be retained by the entity, so you can retain the evidence yourself, and that can be noted in the report so that we know that the QSA company is not keeping the evidence you are, but then you need to make sure that you keep that evidence for long enough that if it's needed to be checked later on, it can be rechecked. So if there's worries about disclosures and confidentiality and all the rest of it, there are provisions to allow evidence to be kept by the entity rather than the assessor if needed, although that should be an exception rather than the rule.
The very few, I think, contract would be probably one of those, or in version 3, remember, we used to look at the full risk treatment plan for an organization and the risk registry, which is sort of like phased out in version 4. But then some companies would, rightly so, not feel comfortable, sending over the risk registry and, for the assessor to keep it. In those situations, you just have to.
It's rare. It does happen, but like you say, it's exceptions rather than the rule. There's the odd thing here and there. So
Plus, on the other hand, this is what clients really. We don't really talk about this, but the reason we retain evidence is because the assessor is going through a quality management program as well by the council. So if the client have an issue or the client's ROC has been selected by QM, sometimes we need to provide evidence of the narratives that we made in the ROC. So that's the reason for us to retain. It's not because we want to. It's sort of like we're required to retain this evidence for 3 years as well.
They do make sure that we're doing our job properly, and that's one of the ways they do it. So we need to be able to prove that we're doing the reports and assessments correctly.
So is it better for organisations to provide everything in terms of evidence up front, or respond as questions come in?
I'm going to say it depends as a standard QSA answer. But that's kind of some of it is fine up front, policies, procedures. The rest of it needs to be done live, and sometimes things will end up being done live just because things change as you go through an assessment. You might discover something and need extra evidence. So it's a bit of a mix on that one. Some of it up front, some of it as we go.
So as the assessment goes on and you covering, I don't know, network security policies or build or whatever it is, you read it then and you read it offline.
Absolutely. When it comes to collating the evidence that you've gathered live, you then match it up with the policies and procedures offline later to make sure that everything lines up with what they say they do and what they actually do and what they should be doing.
So next question for you guys is, if something isn't perfect yet, how should that be handled during the assessment?
Be honest.
Pragmatically, be pragmatically, be honest, Yeah, it does happen from time to time. You're going through an assessment and you find that something's not been done, or a task isn't completed, or a requirement's not met, and it's very much a case-by-case basis as to how you can handle that, whether it can be corrected at the time, whether it needs some extra work or whatever. It depends on what's missing. But it's best to tell the QSA, not to try and hide it, because that's just going to make things worse.
Yeah, it just gets loss of trust, and it's just different. But they're not perfect yet. We also, I think, have to be very clear about this. We always assess a current state, not a future state. So we cannot mark a requirement in place when the client says, well, it's not in place yet, but it will be in 2 months or something, or like next week. Then, the assessment is hold until the control is in place, and then we validate the control. So, it's at the end of an assessment, if it's hoped to be a passing assessment, everything needs to be in place. Nothing is like future.
Yeah, we can't give you the benefit of the doubt that you will do it in the future. It needs to be at the point in time we see it. Assessment is a point in time checking that you are compliant as you should be. So if you feel like you're not going to be ready, then let's delay the assessment. Let's put it off until the time when such things are going to be ready.
And things come out during the assessment. So I think I'm not sure about you, and maybe unless a couple of reassessment that you do for years and years with a client, but there's always one or two things. It doesn't have to be major. It's something minor. I don't know, a documentation issue or whatever, something's missing, which is not the end of the world. Unfortunately, PCI is not one of, like ISO, like you can pass with a non-conformity major or minor, whatever it is. PCI is a black and white. It's either there or it isn't. And if it isn't, you just cannot be compliant.
Yeah, and minor things can be corrected as you go. Like if a documentation hasn't been reviewed, it can be reviewed during the assessment, because the assessment happens over a period of time. So minor things that can be corrected as we go through is fine. We can correct them. Sometimes you come out with something bigger that can't be, like a system's not been patched and not possible to patch, and it's got to be replaced, in which case everything might have to go on hold until such time as those changes can be made and an assessment can be done. But hopefully that doesn't happen.
Great, thank you guys. Do you have any sort of practical things or top tips that organizations can do to make the assessment run smoothly overall?
I have somebody responsible for the assessment on their end as well, because if we keep trying to keep in touch with several people, waiting for evidence, tracking progress, it just becomes a nightmare. So if there's a coordinator on the other end, that's immensely helpful. At least that's my experience.
Yeah, no, that makes a huge difference. As well as just planning. If it's not your first assessment, then you should have an idea of exactly what we're going to be looking at and what we're going to be doing. So you should be able to get the right people in the right place at the right time, because we're not doing anything groundbreaking year on year. So proper planning in advance of the assessment to go, okay, you're going to need to speak to these people, to speak to those people, to speak to these people, and see these documents can make things run a lot more smoothly. If it's your first assessment, then that can be a little harder to judge, but hopefully with enough pre-assessment planning and meetings with the QSA before the assessment happens, it should have a good idea of who's going to be talking about what. Usually, especially if you've got departments spread across time zones globally, and you're trying to schedule that, you really do need to be on top of planning as who's going to be around when, because that can be a real nightmare with time zone differences and working practices and different bank holidays and God knows what.
Yeah. And then if you have a coordinator, or even if you don't, like people being aware of the topic of the conversation, it sounds so like basic, but unfortunately, sometimes when you get on a call, which potentially could, be scheduled either weeks or a long time ahead, the person turns up and is like, well, that's not my responsibility. And then, so understanding what expected.
Having topics in the agenda of the meeting so people know what they're talking about when they come in. Yeah. No, I agree. Always a good idea.
So how do organizations know whether they should be doing a self-assessment or a full assessed engagement?
Transaction volume.
Yep.
Comes down not pounds and dollars, but physical actual transactions, annually speaking. How many transactions do you do annually on branded credit or debit cards, and then compare that to the levels set by the various brands. So generally speaking, over 6 million a year is going to put you into full assessment as a merchant. Anything below that will usually be self-assessed, depending on a number of other factors.
Yeah, contractual obligations, card brands. I think MasterCard now requires their level 2 merchants going through a full assessment as well, I think. But yeah.
If you're in doubt, speak to your acquiring bank, because they will know how many transactions you put through and be able to tell you whether they need a full ROC or a Quest SAQ. If you're a service provider, then you should be asking the merchants you're providing services to which one they want. Some will want SAQ, some will want actual full assessments. It largely depends on what service you're providing and to who you're providing it.
Yeah. But I think what you said is very important. That talk to your acquirer, because the acquirer is sort of like the king in this situation. Like either merchant or service provider report their compliance to the acquirer, not to the card brands, not to the PCI council, to their acquirers, and the acquirer can impose whatever they want on them. So yeah.
If you've had a breach or suspected breach, the acquirer will generally want a full assessment, or at least a partial assessment, or if they just don't trust you, which can happen for various reasons. They say they are king, they are ultimate authority, they're the ones who require you to be compliant. So be guided by them, assuming they're willing to speak to you. Some of them can be a little hard to get on the phone sometimes.
Amazing, thank you guys. How do you avoid being either too strict or too optimistic when assessing yourself?
That's a tough one.
You used the word pragmatic earlier. I think that would be the guiding light. Try to be as pragmatic as you can be. But again, at the end of the day, it boils down to a yes or no question. If you have a good understanding of the intent of the requirement, you should be able to determine whether whatever you do is a yes or it's a no.
Yeah, understanding intent is crucial. The version 4 of the standard was very good at clarifying the intent of requirements in the actual standard. Each requirement gives you what the intent is. It gives you guidance notes. So look there and try to work out if you're doing that. From the questionnaire, the SAQs, they've got expected testing. That's the kind of thing they'd expect you to test to work out whether you are meeting the intent. So be guided by that. I don't know whether people are generally too strict or optimistic when assessing. What I tend to find with people doing themselves and a lack of understanding is they explode their scope too much. They don't quite understand what should or should not be in scope, and they either end up with a scope that's far too broad or far too narrow. When it comes down to interpreting actual requirements, most people are pretty good at that, because there's nothing fancy in the requirements, nothing groundbreaking or anything cutting edge language wise. It's fairly obvious, but applying it to systems that should be out of scope, or not applying it to systems that should be in scope, is where I find most people will fall down.
Yeah, because if you think about it, the SAQs do not have a scoping section in them. So like how you should do scoping is not included. So the client goes in and they have an understanding, and which is why I think even in our practice, I think we see it more and more often that even like significantly lower tier merchants who are compliance conscious, they come to a QSA, either do a gap analysis or have some sort of consultancy to understand whether their understanding of the requirement is in line with, like a professional understanding. And then it doesn't mean that they we keep working with them, but maybe we do their first SAQs going through the process and they, take it over from that point on. I think it happens more and more often, obviously.
Yeah, it certainly does. And they do generally, once the knowledge has been transferred, it tends to hang around. So then the business should be confident enough to be able to do the assessment themselves the following year.
And who should be doing the self-assessment within an organisation? Is that compliance? Is it security? Is it engineering? So where does that responsibility sit?
Yes to all of the above.
Yes. It's a coordinated effort in the best case scenario. Yes.
Yeah, it usually gets dumped to IT's door in smaller organizations, but it goes beyond that. It does require compliance. It requires HR, finance. It requires executive management even as well to buy in to the fact the organization has to be compliant as an organization. So, that's why when people was mentioning earlier about having a coordinator on their side, that also works when you're self-assessing, having somebody in the business who coordinates the assessment internally can work with those different divisions and get all the required evidence and checks done is the easiest way to do it.
Yeah. And if you think about it, the standard is so vast, right? So it's from network controls to build to encryption to patching to training, HR. There's a lot of departments involved in it. And I think the risk is if somebody's taking ownership of it, there are blind spots that are not fully understood on outside of their little group how things are done. So if it's people get together in unity, hopefully that would be probably the best approach.
How often should organisations be revisiting or refreshing a self-assessment outside of the annual cycle, if at all?
But you're compliant for a year, right? So that's the premise of it. But if something changes, I guess, or there's a compromise maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're doing self-assessments, it might not come up, but certainly on the full assessment, there's the requirement to do quarterly internal reviews of the processes to make sure they're being done. That comes up on the full ROC assessment and for service providers. But something like that is probably what you want, because there's a lot of activities that can be manual in complying with them, a lot of things that require a human to physically go and do something rather than an automated system. And if that gets missed, you're going to have a problem. And if you don't realize it's been missed until 6 months later, it makes the problem even worse. So I don't know whether you revisit the whole assessment, but there certainly should be some kind of ongoing oversight to the compliance status.
Yeah, just make sure your scope is in line with what you're expecting. There's no scope drift in any way. But again, for a merchant, if it's a full assessment, you need to do it annually. If you're a service provider, you have to do it every 6 months. So sort of you're not revisiting your compliance, but you're just making sure you're on track.
Years ago, it used to be seen as compliance was something that you did once a year, but they've tried over the past few versions to move to be compliance being a status of the organization that is continuous, to try and encourage it to be a continuous thing rather than we'll do this quarterly to make sure we're doing it, or we'll do this annually. We'll just be compliant continuously in everything you do.
Great, thank you guys. What should organizations be keeping from a self-assessment so that they're better prepared if they go on to need a full assessment?
Oh, that's interesting.
My first thought would be all the evidence that, when you've found evidence to tick the box that says yes, keep that evidence, whatever it is that you've determined, whether it's a policy or an export from a configuration or a configuration standard, or even just writing in where the location of where that was found. So if if it's the configuration, which systems did you look at? You don't necessarily have to keep the screenshots, but knowing where you got that evidence last year can help with reassessments.
Scope definition, the diagrams, network diagram, data flow diagram, all of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, realistically, you should keep all evidence because they might require you to prove you are compliant should a breach come up. So, just because you completed a self-assessment doesn't mean you are compliant. If a breach happens, they'll send in the forensic guys, and at that point, you'll need to provide the evidence to them that proves you were compliant at the point you had the problem. Or at least, like I say, if you don't keep the evidence, keep a note of where you found that evidence, so that if you need to go back to it, you can go back and find it. Just from a proof point of view that you did the assessment correctly, and also back up in case you have a breach.
Yeah, and as you said, should you have a need to evidence that you actually did it in case of a breach or something when it gets uncomfortable? Yeah, just keep everything.
Yeah, because if you have a breach and you're found to be compliant with all the requirements at the point the breach happened, which I should point out I don't think has ever happened in history. But if that is the case, then they won't subject you to any fines or penalties if you're compliant at the point you were breached and you were still breached. But the only way you could do that is with evidence that you met all the requirements at the given point in time. So, keep it, or keep a reference to where it was, definitely.
So what should organisations do differently if their assessment this year follows a lot of changes within the business?
When you make significant changes in the business, the key thing you need to have done is checked your compliance status after that change. Check that the scope hasn't changed. Check that there aren't new things in scope that weren't there before. Check that there aren't new requirements that are now applicable that weren't before, and go through them and make sure that if there are new requirements, you're doing them. If there are new systems, you update all the documentation, you update the processes to cover them. I'm thinking of also things like, I don't know whether you've ever come across it, Tibor, but business acquisitions. They acquire another business between assessments, and compliance now needs to extend to the new combined business or group business or whatever it is. Those can cause some real upheavals in compliance, if not done properly.
Yeah. So, but as the question, what do we do differently? I guess during the assessment, everything is the same. Your scope may change, but leading up to the assessment, as you said, if there's a change, make sure even, significant change procedure is documented in the standard. So it gives you an item by item list of what you need to do. And if it's not perhaps a significant change, then just make sure your change tickets are in order, the change is traceable, you're able to explain what happened, and
because if you have a significant change, your QSA is going to want to see the evidence that you dealt with it correctly. They're going to pick on that change because it's a significant one. So after you've made the change, put all that evidence to one side, collate it all somewhere so that you can, when you come up for next year's assessment, you can go to the QSA, we had this change, we've done this, and this, and all the evidence and stuff around that change is already there. You don't have to go scrambling around going, oh, who's got this ticket and who's got that bit of evidence? It's not sprung on the QSA. The evidence, the actual assessment itself won't actually change. They're still going to look at the same things and answer the same requirements. I guess it's worth also pointing out that if you make changes to your scope between assessments, that doesn't invalidate your assessment. You don't need to reassess just because you've significantly changed your scope. Because compliance is continuous, you should make those reassessments and reevaluations of your scope and requirements after you make that change, and then the QSA will come up at your annual time and do a point in time to check the whole thing. So you don't need to reassess because you changed your scope. And
I guess the natural next question would be, is what a significant change is. Yes. And luckily, but this was always a point of, I would actually go as far as contention with clients. Why the assessor thinks a change within their organization constitutes a significant change. And we were always left without any shield from the standard. It wasn't really clearly defined what a significant change was. But luckily in version 4, we got our saving grace. So there's a section in the ROC that explains a significant change. Well, it's not an exhaustive list, obviously, but it gives an idea of what a significant change is. So if there's any doubt, just go into the standard itself and just search significant change. There's a list there you can find.
Yeah, there is a guidance on what's considered to be significant change with examples and everything else. So it's much clearer now than it used to be. Yeah, there were always discussions over, is this significant enough to class as significant or not? So the guidance is there. You should be able to do it.
Thank you so much for your time today, guys. If any of our listeners would like to ask Alastair or Tibor a question, there'll be a link in the description for this episode, and that will take you to a form on our website. So you can just fill that in, and the question will come to us, or you can just pop it in the comment section of this video. So thank you very much for listening today, and we will see you next time. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could spare a moment to leave a rating or review at ratethispodcast.com/InfoSec Insider. To listen to more episodes, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Podbean.
Thank you for listening to URM's InfoSec Insider podcast. For more information, visit our website at urmconsulting.com.